Okay, if you look over here, you can see our player's start location. So this trigger I have in front of him is what's going to make everything happen. So let's double click on that. Now go to Outputs. Now you can see I have a whole bunch of events occurring when you walk over this. And notice under the delay column, I have different events occurring at different times. This lets me activate many events in the right order all in one step. So we'll go ahead and follow this in order. The first thing that happens when I walk over this is that I have an entity named UFO starting forward. This is the Turbo Cheese ship taking off. Let's close this window and we'll take a look at it. Here you can see the ship on its side over here. Now you might think this is the UFO, but if you click on it, you can see I named this ship and it's actually a dynamic prop. To take a look at what the trigger is pointing at, I'm going to use the camera tool so we can dive inside this thing. There, you see that magenta box there? That's what we want. And if you click on it, you can see the name, UFO. This is the train that moves the UFO up. Now if you double click on it, you can see the first target here is Landing 1. So let's go and find that. Landing 1 is right over here. And if you look up, there's Landing 2. So this is a simple track. The UFO just goes straight up. This is also the reason why the UFO is lying on its side the way it is. This is just like what we learned earlier. We're using the train to move this object. And I can tell you right now, there was a lot of trial and error with lining this up right. I had to make sure it was the right height so it didn't go through the floor, hover above the ground, was facing the right way, etc. So these things are kind of a pain to set up, but they get the job done. Now let's see what's next on our list. Go and double click on the trigger again. Back to Outputs. And we have a couple different things happening at the 2-second mark. Let's look at the entity named Spark first. This is the fuse for the cannon sparking before it actually fires. Close this, then head over to the back here. Now the first thing you may notice is that the cannon isn't in the right place. This is because it's on a train track too. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So the sparks are actually where the fuse to the cannon is going to show up. Things like this are the reason I'm not creating this from scratch again. There's a dozen or so little adjustments that were fine-tuned to create this movie here that would take forever to do again. If you double click on the spark, you'll see that there's not a whole lot in the way of options. Just an entity that sparks. However, if we head back to the trigger over here, you can look at all the inputs possible for this entity. So double click on it, go to Outputs, and the command we have is Start Spark. If you go to the drop-down menu, you can see your other options. Most of these we don't have a use for, but at the bottom you can see there are ones related to sparking. I don't have time to go over every entity in Hammer, but for a lot of your special effects like this, you can usually figure out what to put for the input just from looking at the names. Alright, let's see what's next. It says the entity bystander 1 is going to start. That start input means that this is a scene file, so let's go take a look at that. The scene file here is used to animate the crowd inside the store. See, here's bystander 1, and if you double click on it, you can get some more information about it. If you click on the input tab here, it will tell you the names of any entities sending input to it. See right here, there's our trigger that we'll be walking over, telling this to start. And if you go back to the class info tab, you can see which scene file this will be using. I've actually cleaned this part up from the original map. Since we created so many scene files during the rest of the tutorial, all the scene files from the actual movie will have the prefix GG- to prevent confusion. Okay, so this scene controls part of the crowd, and I think this one right here controls the rest of them. Let's go back to the trigger and see what's next. So double click on that, go to Outputs, and it looks like the next thing to start is the scene file called Samurai Fight. That's in that row with the others, but let's take a quick look at our samurai here. I'll use the camera tool for this. Okay, these are our samurai. You'll notice they're just combined soldiers in Hammer here, but that's because they're using that same trick we used on the Turbo Chi earlier. They're also facing back to back like they're in a pistol duel. However, that's because of how their animations are positioned for them. Believe it or not, this actually lines up correctly once the animation starts playing. The scene file is what's going to show them slap fighting prior to the impact from the dwarf. Alright, let's check our trigger again. Double click on it, Outputs. And next is an entity called Dwarf Shout, and it's being told to play sound. Let's close this and I'll show you what this is about. This is controlling an entity we haven't covered yet called an ambient generic. These are used to play sound files in the game. If you double click on it, you can see the options it has. Besides the name, the main value you want to pay attention to is the sound name. This tells you what sound file to play. We have D-Fire up here since that sound file has already been entered into the game's scripts. If you click on Browse, you can see all the sound files you have available. Okay, actually, this looks like a mess. I'm not sure what's happening. Let's scroll down a bit. Yeah, this is better. This is what your list of sound files normally looks like. I don't know why our custom ones are all bunched together. It wasn't always like this. There's obviously some sort of bug going on here. I'm not sure what. So maybe Browse isn't the best option. Let's close this. If you run into this sort of problem, just do like I've already done here and type in the name of the file you want manually. This won't always play back in Hammer, but I've already tested this and it plays back in the game. And there are other options here like volume and pitch control, but I usually fiddle with that sort of thing in editing. And if you go to flags, there are a few options that are pretty self-explanatory. So close this. And now we'll know to hear a dwarf shout just before the cannon fires. Okay, let's see what's next. Go back to our trigger again. It looks like we have a whole bunch of things happening at 4 seconds after it fires. Let's take these one at a time. Now the first output here is to tell the spark to stop. We already looked at this entity, so let's move on to the next one. Next we're telling a train to start forward. I admit I could have named this better, but what this is referring to is the train that's going to move the spinning dwarf towards the window. We'll have to go around to the back of the building to see this. And there's our train right next to the model of the singed dwarf. This is how the dwarf gets propelled out of the cannon. I originally wanted to make him a physics object and fling him towards the window, but his behavior got too erratic, so we had to use this instead. Go ahead and double click on it. You'll see here the first stop target is named Track. So to see this, let's close this window and head back out to the front again. And there it is, Track. This is the path he'll be following out of the cannon. Now let's head to the back of the building again since there's more stuff to show you. If you double click on the dwarf, you can see he's just a dynamic prop. And notice his parent is the train. If you scroll down, look under default animation. As you can guess from the name, this is what's going to put him in the cannonball pose. And I'm going to risk previewing the animation to hope it turns out correctly. So we'll go to the Model tab. And there it is. This looks a little choppy because I'm recording, but it's actually pretty smooth. Now you may have noticed there's another new entity over here that we should cover, an environment fire. This is what makes him look like he's on fire when he's being shot out of the cannon. If you double click on it, you get a few parameters. Notice how the parent is Cannonball, which is what I named the spinning dwarf model. So the fire is parented to the dwarf, which is parented to the train. So everything is moving relative to this train. All aboard. Okay, that about covers how our dwarf is going to be shot out of the cannon. Let's head back over to the trigger to see what's next. Okay, next the cannonball is being told to turn on. I guess that means we're not done with this after all. What this command does is tell the object to become visible again. Let's close this for a second. If you look over here, this is where the train and the dwarf are going to appear when the map starts. However, that's a problem because we don't want them to appear until the cannon fires. So what I did was use a logic auto entity to tell the dwarf to start off invisible. Go and double click on it here, then go to Outputs. See? On map spawn, cannonball, turn off. Turn off tells the prop to become invisible. So when the trigger is telling it to turn on, that means it's reappearing because it's ready to be fired. Alright, let's look at the trigger again. Double click on it, Outputs. Now the next entity in line is the environment fire we looked at earlier. The input here is start fire, which is pretty self-explanatory. If you look at the different options for the fire entity, the main ones that jump out are start fire and extinguish. So if you know which entity you need, you can usually figure out how to activate it. Our next entity is named Boom and is set to explode. This points to an environment explosion entity which you can see over here. If you double click on it, you can see a few of the parameters you have. You can change the size, the appearance, etc. Now I realize I'm glossing over this, but remember, if I don't do this, then the tutorial will never end. There's a lot to learn in Hammer, but let's continue going over what's here. Double click on the trigger again. Our next entity in line is named Cannon Train. This is the train for our cannon, telling it to start forward. Now if you've ever fired a live cannon at your neighbors, you'll know that the cannon doesn't just stay still right after it fires. It's going to kick back pretty hard. Isaac Newton could tell you that. So what I did is have the cannon jolt backwards right after it fires, which is what this train is here for. And if we zoom inside the cannon, there's our train. Now double click on it. Now see that our first stop target here is cannon track. So let's close this and take a look at that. See, there's cannon track and cannon track 1. The cannon doesn't go very far. I just didn't want it to be completely still after shooting a dwarf out of it. Alright, let's see what's next for our trigger. Only one more. This is telling the entity Crowd 2 to start. This is the name for a logic choreographed scene that we can go take a look at inside the store. If you double click on it, you can see the scene file it's pointing to, and that's about all we're going to cover here. This is controlling the crowd behavior before and after the impact from the cannon. Now you may be wondering why I have 3 separate scene files here when I can control all the characters with just one. The reason for this is because whenever one of your characters dies, it immediately stops the rest of the scene in its tracks. Now we're not actually killing people in the movie, but in order to get everyone to knock over, we need to tell Hammer to kill some of the NPCs who are in the line of fire. So we're going to be killing several NPCs here. So if this was all part of one scene, then the scene file would end and it wouldn't play the rest of it for the ones that are still alive. So by splitting the scenes up, you can still kill characters without ruining the entire scene as a whole. That's a handy tip to know. So, speaking of killing people, let me show you how that's going to work. I guess skip this if you're squeamish or something. Now we're done with our trigger, but the sequence of events isn't over yet. Our dwarf is going to be traveling along this path here. This is all pretty simple until we get to this point at the window here, then it gets more complicated. Go and double click on this path track here. Now go to Outputs. Notice how this entity has all these values of onPass here. This is a function I probably should have mentioned earlier, but we'll go over it now instead. Both path tracks and path corners have the option of outputting a command when a train or an NPC passes through them. So I'm actually using these points in the track as an extra trigger to continue the events for this scene. Now for these first values I have window 1 set to shatter and window 2 set to break. It's not hard to guess what I'm doing with these. One problem I noticed when creating this scene was that the window wouldn't always smash when the dwarf crashed into it. So rather than leave that to chance, I made sure they would break when the dwarf got close enough by using these commands here. I have 2 commands because I'm actually using 2 different types of windows here, so there will be more glass. I'm not going to go over the differences between them, but I will point out where they are. Here's the first one, window 1, and if you go around to the back, this is window 2. Now you'll notice this no draw texture painted all over it. That's just another specialty texture that tells Hammer not to draw anything on this surface when you're looking at it inside the game. It's needed for some windows. So all you really need to know here is that these windows are going to break when the dwarf moves over that path track. Okay, let's see what's next. Go and double click on that same path track, then go to Outputs again. And notice here I have commands for the 2 samurai to set their health to 0. This will kill the samurai and allow them to get knocked over. So we're creating the illusion that it's the dwarf knocking them over, when in reality we're using a kill switch. The dwarf's train will still run into them, however, which makes for a more realistic looking collision. Alright, close this window, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next track point. It's inside the store here, named Track 5. Double click on it and go to Outputs again. Okay, what's happening here is we're just activating more kill switches. These names on the left are the names of the different NPCs standing in the way. So when the train passes through here, these NPCs will all collapse at slightly different time intervals, so it looks like the dwarf is causing it. If you want to close the window here, you can click on them to see who's who. Bystander, Fodder 1, Fodder 3, Fodder 2. It's going to look like the dwarf is knocking them all over. Alright, the next thing that's going to happen is that it'll run into all these chips. This is entirely a physics-based collision, and it's going to be really choppy in the game, but you can record it later so it plays smoothly. If you click on one of the chips, I actually have these items grouped together. I'm going to ungroup them temporarily by selecting them and pressing Ctrl U. Alternately, you can group any items in Hammer together by selecting them and pressing Ctrl G. Now if I click on this again, it's a smaller group now, so I may have to do this a couple times. I grouped these bags of chips together several times so I wouldn't have to position every single bag individually. Okay, now we're down to just one. If you double click on one of the bags, then go to Flags, and you can see the box Start Asleep is checked. This means that these bags won't move until something bumps into them, like a flaming dwarf. you can go ahead and close this, and I'm going to hit Ctrl-Z a few times to put them back in their groups. Ctrl-Z will undo any of your recent actions in Hammer. Okay, so after he crashes into the chips, let's follow the path to see what happens next. Oh, this is worth noting. This entity here looks like an info target, but it's actually a physics ragdoll magnet. What this does is draw any ragdoll bodies towards it. So when those NPCs collapse, they're going to be drawn towards this entity to an extent. I did this so that it looks like the dwarf is really slamming into them rather than just knocking them aside. If you double click on it here, you can go to the force value and specify how strong a pull you want, and it gives you a sense of scale in the description. Alright, go ahead and close this. And let's look at the remaining path tracks and see what they do. I'll double click on this one, go to Outputs, and this one doesn't do anything. It's just another point in the path. So let's close this one and look at the last one. Double click on it. Outputs. Here we go. Okay, our first command is Cannonball, kill. Fire, kill. Now when you tell Hammer to kill an entity like this, it doesn't mess around. It removes it entirely from the map. It's like it never existed. So when this dwarf reaches the end of the destination, he's just going to vanish. That's because I don't want a flaming dwarf just spinning there in the corner of the store. What I do want is the dwarf to look like he's getting up off the ground. That brings us to our next output here. We have an entity named Beam, and we're going to tell it to teleport. This is for an entity called a point teleport. Let's close this window and take a look at it. It's this purple cube right above the scorch mark here. This is used to teleport other entities to where it's located. Go and double click on it, and see the value here, entity to teleport, and we have burnt dwarf. And if you head back behind the building, here's our burnt dwarf. This is an actual NPC because we're going to want him to play a scene file of him getting up and looking around. So when the point teleport entity is activated, he'll teleport in no matter where he is. Now let's look at that last path track again. Oops, wrong one. Go and double click on it. And the last output is for an entity named Crispy to start. This is the name for the logic choreographed scene to start the dwarf after he teleports in. And you can double click on it here and see the scene file it's pointing to. So, that covers this map. Let's go back over it quick.